So I'd like to explore with you what I think is an amazing blessing connected with Yom Kippur. The blessing is the 13 attributes of compassion that we chant in the Torah service. We chanted on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and on the other major holidays. We chant them in Slichot, and they're known as the 13 midot of Rachamim in Hebrew. And Rachamim can also be translated as mercy. As I've mentioned to you before, for me, Judaism revolves around two main poles. The first pole is engagement with the world through acts of tikkun, of healing, and of justice. And the second pole is giving us a framework for going deeper spiritually. So you could say that my talk on Rosh Hashanah, on police brutality and racism was an example of the first pole, and then today is number two. So why am I talking about this? Because I want us, through sharing these ideas, to make a stronger connection with what I think is an essential piece of liturgy and of Torah. And it's what I would call a kind of through line through the entire Jewish tradition, stretching back over, close to 3,000 years, that these words have held power and mystery for our people throughout these thousands of years. There's a lot that we can cut from the Yom Kippur liturgy. Perhaps there's more that we should cut, but I can guarantee you that we can't cut these. And I know that 500 years from now, when folks find Jews living on this earth, we will still be chanting the 13 attributes of compassion. These words take us into the primordial mystery. Ever since I first started reconnecting with Judaism in my early 20s, I always felt that something deep was encoded in them. So let's look at them. Let's start at the beginning. So I'm going to ask our Mark Cook, our tech support, to share our text here. So we'll go up to the first text. Great. Okay, so this is where they appear. Exodus 34. It's one of the climactic moments of Exodus. The golden calf incident has just occurred, has just happened, following right after the intense experience at Sinai and the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments. But now with the golden calf, the people have collectively ruptured their relationship with God. And in the process of restoring God's commitment to the people, Moshe says, God, please show me your presence. Hareini kavodecha. God expresses willingness to do this, but says, I'm not going to show you the divine face. And then instructs Moshe to carve 2 new tablets like the ones he smashed when he came down from the mountain the first time and saw the golden calf. And so Moses does this. Incidentally, the day that he goes back up to get this blessing of the 13 midot, the 13 attributes, with these second tablets, is understood by the rabbis to be Yom Kippur. That's also one of the profound connections with this day. So he goes back up, and then the Torah says this. It says, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh came down in the cloud. He stationed himself beside him there and called out the name of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And then the next verse, and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh passed before his face and called Yud-He-Vav-He, Yud-He-Vav-He, God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abundant in kindness and truth, keeping kindness for 1,000 ages, forgiver of iniquity, willful sin, and error, and who cleanses, but does not cleanse completely, vinake lo yinake in Hebrew, recalling the iniquity of parents upon children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. Now, there are at least two really striking things about this text. We'll keep the screen share up. There's many things we could say, but there's two super striking things I want to lift up. First is notice how ambivalent the pronouns are. You see that in the first text. He stationed himself beside him there and called out the name. The Hebrew for he could refer to God or to Moshe. Who is stationing who where? Which is God? Which is Moshe? Who called out the name Yud-He-Vav-He? Did God call it out? Did Moshe call it out? As Rabbi Ruth Gon Kagan taught me recently, it's like the Leonard Cohen song, Who by Fire, that we offer as a dramatic reading in our Yom Kippur services that ends, and who shall I say is calling, right? Who is calling? We don't know. It's mysterious. The second point is that the actual biblical text that I just read is, of course, not what we chant in the liturgy. The rabbis made a radical, really ultra chutzpahdik move, one of their most reconstructionist acts, I think, that in rendering the text for liturgical use, they cut off the end of the text after vinake. And so instead of the vinake, the lo yinake, and then the continuing on of the poket avon, avot al abanim, they just cut it at vinake and then put that into the liturgy. And what that does is it dramatically changes the meaning of the text, of this latter part of the text, from this unqualified, it changes it to an unqualified sense of God's cleansing. So it removes the idea of God recalling the sins of the parents upon the next generations. It's, grammatically it works relatively well. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. So the retribution element is removed, and now there's only vinake, only an invocation of God's forgiveness. And then they put this text, as we know it, as the 13 midot of compassion, into the liturgy, particularly making it the core of the slichot prayers. Let me just say a little bit more about lift up a few of the actual 13 attributes. So if you could just move us down a little bit to get, great. Okay, so we could talk about all of them, but for the sake of time, I'll just lift up a few. So the first one is the first one I want to talk about is the fourth one, Rachum. So as you see in the translation, Rachum is connected to the word in Hebrew and in Arabic, actually, of rechem, right? It's the same root in Semitic languages, right? And our Muslim cousins continually, more so than us even, talk about God as the Rahman Rahim, the most merciful, the most compassionate. But it's connected with this core meaning of womb. So we'll talk about that more. The next is V'chanun, the next word, from the word for grace, which is chen. But the rabbis like to comment on this of connecting it to the word chinam, which means free. Like in modern Hebrew, if something doesn't cost anything, it's chinam, it's free. And so that this is this quality that is freely given, this quality of divine favor, of regard, that has nothing to do with any, calculating. It's just freely, abundantly, continually given. And the next one, erech hapayim, conventionally you always see this translated in a conventional sense, not in a literal sense. It's variously translated as patient, slow to anger, long suffering, but it literally means long-nosed. An af is a nose. Erech hapayim is long-nosed. And that's because in biblical Hebrew, the af, the word for nose, is how anger is expressed. Like classically, Vayichar af Hashem, like God's nose, as it were, flares. And you see this with people, like when we get angry, there's like our nose kind of like, it's like, the flaring. And so this is the opposite. Instead of like the short-nosed flaring, this is like the long nose, that the anger is ameliorated through the long nose. Well, we'll talk about that more later. Rav chesed, great in chesed. Chesed is a word for love, loving kindness, very important in Kabbalah. Ve'emet, truth, right? That truth is a divine quality. Important to remember as we live through the times that we're living in, that right? Truth, schmooth, alternative facts. No, truth is really important. And I guess the last one I'll lift up is two after truth, nosei avon. This is conventionally translated as forgiving sin, forgiving misdeed, but nosei actually means carrying, lifting up. So it's like a more palpable image, right, of God like lifting up misdeed, like lifting up our sins and like carrying them away, taking them upon God's self, right? It's like taking them off us and carrying them. Okay, so we can stop the screen share. So that's the biblical context, right? That's all just pretty much straight Bible. So let's move to the next layer, as it were, the rabbinic textual world, and look at two rabbinic texts to see how these 13 attributes evolved further. So in a famous passage from the Talmud in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Yochanan comments on our verse where it says, Yud He Vav He passed before his face and called out. Rabbi Yochanan says, whoa, if this wasn't written in the Torah, I couldn't say it. This teaches that the Blessed Holy One wrapped himself in a talit. It is himself in this context, right? Normally I don't, try not to translate God in that kind of gendered way, but to be fair to Rabbi Yochanan here and his image, wrapped himself in a talit, like a prayer leader, like a shliach tzibur, and showed Moshe the structure of the order of the prayer. He said to him, here conventionally understood as God said to Moshe, whenever the Jewish people sin, let them act before me according to this order, and I will forgive them. It is generally understood to mean let the prayer leader wrap himself in a talit, and publicly call out the 13 attributes. Then right after that, Rav Yehuda adds that if the 13 attributes are mentioned, one will not return empty-handed, meaning that prayer will be answered. Fast forward a little over 1,000 years to the teachings of a prominent Tzfat Kabbalist. He also lived in Hebron, Eliyahu Davidus. He was part of the greater Tzfat circle. He comments on this Talmud passage and he writes, "This is a difficult thing because we see that many times we mention the 13 midot and are not answered. But the Geonim, the prominent generation of rabbis after those of the Talmud, say that the intention of this line from the Talmud of let them act before me according to this order does not just mean wrapping in a talit, but that they should follow the order of the midot, the order of these divine qualities that the Holy One taught Moshe. God is compassionate and gracious, so just like God is compassionate, so should you be compassionate. And similarly, for all the 13 midot." And with this idea of that you can call, is conventionally known as imitatio Dei from the Latin, of imitating God, the idea appears earlier in the Talmud, but Eliyahu Davidus is particularly bringing it here to say that, wait a second, we should understand this Talmud text a little differently. Because there's a rather remarkable transformation that has happened in these two texts. In the Talmud piece, the 13 midot are a kind of powerful formula, almost magical, where, say, you have a situation of the Jewish people in need of forgiveness. You recite the 13 midot publicly, and voila, guaranteed 100% forgiveness all the time. But no, Eliyahu Davidus says 400 years ago, not sure it really works that way. These words are not intended as some kind of potent liturgical, spiritual formula. They are instructions for us to internalize. Our guidance for what to do and how to conduct ourselves is encoded here. And of course, with that idea, you can then take these in a very secular humanist way as well. You could take most of these qualities as kind of ultimate guiding values, without any belief in God, exactly. Let's explore for a few moments what it would mean, this idea of emulating God through these qualities. Doing this is really a lifetime, perhaps multiple lifetime practice, but I just want to suggest a few things to concretize this. So in emulating the divine in this way, we shift ourselves, as it were, from being, in rabbinic parlance, we're shifting from being in the side of judgment, of din, to the side of compassion, or rachamim. And the rabbis envisioned this like as affecting God in this way, but we're affecting ourselves in this way. And so that applies to being caught up in judging others, and being caught up in a judgmental state of mind, relating to the world from that kind of priority. That's, a lot of us, that's our primary installation is, let me critique this, that, this, and the other. It's just the default programming. So this is like reordering that programming. And it's also for shifting our tendency towards self-judgment, as that is then a challenge for many of us. Some of us perhaps not so much, but other of us fall into regular self-criticism. We're our own worst critics. We are continually beholden to that voice of critique in all of our heads, and that voice is much stronger and runs more of the show for some of us. But this is saying, no, let's shift over to the side of compassion and not stay in that place of judgment. So let's take this literal-ish image of the erech hapayim, the long nose. I find that in itself contains a kind of practice instruction. It's like when we find ourselves literally in this physical embodied place of the short-nosed kind of anger, this flare, can we lengthen it? It's like, it's this little image of our nose growing longer, and so how does that happen? It's like the breath lengthens it out. It's like an imagining the long breath, lengthening our nose, our face, and dissipating that anger, lengthening it out, not making it so tight and flaring. Similarly, there's a kind of related but different practice instruction with the image of the rechem, of the womb, right, of this core idea of the rachamim, which can also be powerful for working with difficult emotions. I'm going to, again, use the example of anger, but you could take another juicy emotion like jealousy or your choice. And here I'm sharing a teaching I've learned from my teacher, Tzvi Shalom. Talks about that a powerful way of working with negative emotions is that when, say, anger arises, you compassionately hold it, right? That's the womb quality, the holding it. Like a womb just holds and nurtures. It doesn't judge. It holds the fetus, it surrounds it in this kind of gentle holding. So with tapping into that, you acknowledge that the feeling is present, like the anger is there, and you feel it as fully as you can, but you don't act it out. That's many of our normal tendencies. That would be my personally primary tendency to flare, that's the flaring it out, to act it out, but you still feel it, so you don't repress it, right? So that's another tendency I have, probably many of us as well. So you don't repress it and shunt it aside. So it's this middle place of holding, of feeling. Say that, yes, that anger is here, but with that womb-like quality, that compassionate quality, I'm going to hold it with acceptance. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is powerful, speaking from experience. So the tension that I'm lifting up in these two rabbinic texts of, what are we doing with chanting these 13 midot, suggests a larger theological question that I think is interesting and important for us as Reconstructionists, as thoughtful liberal Jews. Are we doing this practice? Are we chanting these to affect God? Or are we trying to awaken and cultivate something within ourselves? The first approach, you could say, has been the traditional Jewish paradigm, and the second approach is the humanist paradigm. And I think that the answer is really yes to that question. Really we're doing both. It's both of these. So following the Jewish mystical tradition, I'd like to invite us into an understanding where the line between the human and the divine is blurry. The separation between us and divinity is much more fluid, certainly than our conventional texts suggest. Except, though, if you think back to the text from Torah that we just learned, right? We don't know who is chanting the attributes. Is it Moshe? Is it God? The text is intentionally ambiguous. And so I'd like to suggest that perhaps when we arouse compassion within us, the image I like is that it's as though we're arousing compassion, we could say, through the whole divine field. This vast field that includes all things, including each one of us. This is a field that we're not separate from, but yet each of us is kind of distinct. We're each a kind of node, temporary node in this field, or a temporary jewel that is shining within it. And then when we chant, it's as though we're a string, vibrating that field, resonating throughout the broader system. And that vast storehouse of divine compassion that is wanting to find expression is made manifest through each of us becoming its channels, expressing that compassion. So it's both something we do in the moment as we chant, and then it's almost like the beautiful thing about the chant in the Ashkenazi tradition is that it doesn't end, it doesn't resolve. We often resolve it when we sing it at Oseh, but in many other places, Vinake, we'll do that in a few minutes. It's like it keeps going, and it's like a bell or like ripples on a lake, that it doesn't end, so it just keeps rippling out. Like, yes, we're chanting it in that moment, but then it's also rippling out once we stop chanting in terms of how we're actually living and interacting with people in the world. So I think that these 13 attributes are an integral part of the cleansing, of the kapara, the wiping clean that we seek on Yom Kippur. And they're also traditionally only chanted in a minyan. It's not a solo practice. It's something that we need other people to generate this kind of collective field, or to vibrate the larger field, perhaps you could say. So we're gonna chant. I'm gonna chant these in just a minute, and because I'm just recording this drash for you right now, this isn't our actual Yom Kippur service. I'm just going to use the name Hashem for God. And have a little bit of a distance, recognizing I'm not doing this in a minyan, and it's not in its liturgical proper place. And also, and then I'm also going to leave the melody a little unresolved, like in the traditional way. And so Mark, if you'll do the screen share again for the last text. Traditionally in the Slichot service, the 13 attributes are introduced with a special liturgical poem. Yeah, great. A piyut known as El Melech, which is a beautiful piyut, but we don't actually at Oseh Shalom have a tradition of chanting it. And so I was inspired to compose my own English invocation for it, that I feel like also updates some of the language in a way that resonates more for me. I hope it resonates more for you. So I invite you to join me. If you're listening to this, if you're watching the video, set down what you're doing, perhaps. Settle into a kind of quiet, prayerful, centered place. God of compassion, El Malei Rachamim, we come before you to chant the 13 qualities of compassion which you showed to Moshe, our teacher, in the earliest primordial days of our tradition. May our chanting of the 13 midot cause compassion, Rachamim, to flow in you and in us, vibrating the strings of our heart and the strings of your heart in one resonance, cleansing all misdeed. May our chanting of the 13 midot inspire us to emulate you your womb-like compassion that holds it all, your boundless patience, erech apayim, your great love, chesed, your desire for truth, emet. May our chanting of the 13 midot be a mikvah for us, immersing us in the purity of our intention, which is your intention, radiating your compassion to a world desperately in need. Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum B'Chanun, Erech Hapayim, B'Rav Chesed V'Emet, Notzer Chesed Le'alafim, Nosei Avon V'Fesha, V'chata v'nakeh. Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim, V'Rav Chesed V'Emet, Notzer Chesed Le'alafim, Nosei Avon V'Fesha, V'chata v'nakeh. Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim, V'Rav Chesed V'Emet, Notzer Chesed Le'alafim, Nosei Avon V'Fesha, V'chata v'nakeh.